I'm at the Curia Pompeia, the Curia of Pompey in Rome. And this is where Julius Caesar, Gaius Julius Caesar, was assassinated. And here at the Curia of Pompey, I want to talk to you not about Gaius Julius Caesar, already talked about him enough, but instead about Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus and how to pronounce the letters GN in Latin. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. When I was speaking Latin to random Romans, I said the words aedificium magnum, and this happened to bother some people who commented that, oh, it should be pronounced edificium magnum. Well, that's the ecclesiastical or traditional Italian pronunciation of Latin. GN, of course, is pronounced gna in Italian as well as French, and of course that's the Italian or ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin. A beautiful pronunciation. But that pronunciation of GN as gna doesn't happen in Latin until after antiquity. It's something that happens in the Western Romance languages. In classical Latin, how is GN to be pronounced then? Well, we have some really interesting examples. The usual common way that people reconstruct the pronunciation is to pronounce it as written. G followed by N, gna. So Magnus, Magnus, like that. But we have inscriptional evidence that shows us that actually it probably should be pronounced in a slightly different way. For example, there's the verb ignoscere, written like this, I-G-N, ignoscere. But this is actually from in, meaning no or not, it's the negation, and gnoscere, gnoscere, which means to know. Now, gnoscere most of the time is actually just noscere, without the G in the beginning, but we'll talk about that in a moment. The fact that it's spelled I-G-N, ignoscere, and the N is dropped away, tells us something really interesting. In fact, we have inscriptional evidence of spellings like ignominiae and ignes, I-N-G-N. And this suggests a pronunciation of something like hangnail. So, what in English would be N-G-N, hangnail. And this actually makes a lot of sense. If GN has a value of ngana, and not a gna, but ngana, the velar nasal, it makes sense why we can actually drop the letter N of the prefix in ignoscere, and in cognatus, which is con, B-C-O-N, gnatus, cognatus. It makes much more sense if the normal Republican, late Republican classical pronunciation is in fact gna, cognatus. Otherwise, cognatus seems a little bit odd. It should be written C-O-N-G-N for something like that. And since it's not, that tells us that there's some kind of different pronunciation. The writer Varro, he mentions also that he talks about the actual name Gnaeus, and I'm pronouncing it like that for now, Gnaeus. He says that this name, it's actually connected with the word Gnaeus. Gnaeus means a birthmark. So here we can see that the etymology of both the name Gnaeus and this Gnaeus, meaning birthmark, this has to do with the Latin verb gignere, which I'm pronouncing like that for now, gignere, or gigno, which is related to generatio, genere, in Greek archaic pronunciation, gignomai. So we have this GN together, which has to do with generation, or even kind, genus. So birth, Gnaeus. In fact, there's an older spelling of the name Gnaeus as Gnaeus, Gnaeus, spelled like that, which shows us the direct connection with the word Gnaeus, meaning birthmark, and therefore that's definitely what the name means. It has something to do with birth or even birthmark. So, how is this actually pronounced? Well, Varro says that in his time, in the 1st century BC, that it used to be pronounced with the G, even though it's spelled with the G, Gnaeus, but that G is something that the ancient people would pronounce, but they don't actually pronounce anymore. In fact, he says there's another version, another spelling of the name, Gnaeus, without the G entirely. And we have Greek transcriptions as well of the name as Gnaeus, like that, Gnaeus. So this shows us that probably initial GN in the beginnings of words, like even the verb gnosco, gnoscere. Well, there's a reason that the standard spelling isn't really gnoscere, but noscere, without the G entirely. And this would seem that the spelling of Gnaeus, like Pompeius, Gnaeus Pompeius, probably he just pronounced it Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. The Magnus in between a word, that would still have some, you would hear some kind of different pronunciation of GN, Gna, or Gna. So probably Pompey himself, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, had that pronunciation. So two different pronunciations of the GN. Initially, it was probably just a plain N sound, Gnaeus, because that's what Varro seems to indicate to us. Gnaeus, and which makes sense since words like gnosco are, and also words like gnatus are just natus. That G is lost in the beginning of words. So the name is probably retaining an archaic spelling with the G that used to be pronounced, but isn't any longer by the classical Latin period. But in the middle of words, like in Magnus, it is pronounced. And here's where we wonder, like, should it actually have a velar nasal sound? Should it be Magnus, like king or sing plus a na? It's a king or sing, ing plus a na, hang nail. Should it be Magnus or should it be Magnus? I think that the pronunciation with an actual released g, because you can release a consonant or not. For example, in American English, at the end of words where there's a T, usually we say hit and cat, and not hits or cat, though we can. That is a pronunciation we can use in English and American English, and it's fine. This is different from, say, British English, which will say hit or cat, where it's a glottal stop. So we actually make the T sound in an American English. We say hit, cat, but we don't release it. So this is probably what's happening. And I've heard Italians actually use this pronunciation when they've been speaking Latin in a relaxed way, where they've said Magnus, and they're not trying to do a velar nasal, but it kind of sounds like that anyway, because it's an unreleased g sound, Magnus, Magnus. So if you say Magnus or Magnus, I mean, it's hard to hear the difference. Magnus, 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 they sound almost identical. And maybe that's what helped create this velar nasal as a normal sort of pronunciation. And hence, ignosco, where we don't need the first letter N of that prefix, in. And what about the actual way to spell the name Gnaeus? It's spelled CN for the exact same reason that Gaius is abbreviated with the letter C, because the letter G was invented later in the 3rd century, after a lot of these names and even the abbreviations were standardized for a really long time. So some people, I received some comments, who were confused about the whole thing with Gaius and the letter C. So the letter C, that shape represented both G and K. G and K are normal sounds in Latin, and that the distinction was made to help improve the orthography of Latin. But the abbreviation of the letter C is always used for Gaius in standard Latin from antiquity to this day, never letter G. And the same thing is true with Gnaeus, which is a Gnaeus or simply Gnaeus, it can be however you want, which is always with a CN and not a GN as the abbreviation, even though the standard spelling is GNAEUS. So spelling with a C is incorrect if you're spelling the full name. Only CN in the abbreviation to preserve an archaic orthography. The later Roman grammarians, such as Terentius Maurus, say that GN, as in the name Gnaeus, they actually say the G is pronounced. What this indicates probably is that in later Latin pronunciation, at the end of or after classical Latin is over, there's a spelling pronunciation that develops. Instead of Magnus, it may be Magnus. Instead of Gnaeus or Gnaeus or something like that, it may be Gnaeus. Again, Gnaeus. Or Gnaeus, depending on who's actually saying it. So, I like to recommend pronunciations. I would say if you're doing classical Latin pronunciation, it's okay to do a GN as written, Magnus. You can even release it. Probably that's not very authentic, but that's okay, Magnus. Leaving a consonant unreleased in Latin, this happens. For example, venit ne should be wenitne, wenitne. That sounds better just because those consonants are close together, and not releasing it is more natural. Just like Ariadna, Ariadna, not Ariadna, Ariadna, Ariadna. So I would recommend having an unreleased G sound, Magnus, or doing a full-on velar nasal, Magnus. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing. From the center of Rome, from the Curia Pompeia and the theater of Pompey, where Gaius Julius Caesar was assassinated, Valete. Shows us the direct connection with the word GNAEVS, the word with the word GNAEVS meaning birthmark.
Okay.
So in fact, a different pronunciation, GN, GNA, or GNA.
Okay.
So instead of Magnus, but of Pompey, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, written like this. IGN, ignoscere, but this is actually from in, meaning no or not, it's the negation, and gnoscere. So, when in English would be NGN. The GN of the GN, therefore, so the name Gnaeus is related to Naevus, meaning, so that that's attested. So that actually shows us that this is almost certainly very closely known as GNAEVS.